Hello, everyone. Welcome to another film flashback. It's Matthew, as usual, joined by Nick, as usual. Today, we decided that we would flash back to a movie from 1984. This is John Milius's action drama masterpiece. This is Red Dawn.
We live here.
Not bad for a bunch of kids, huh?
Mama'd be real proud.
Wolverines!
Okay, man, I'm really excited to get into this and talk about Red Dawn with you because I hadn't seen Red Dawn until we just finished it, and I had only ever heard the most simple logline of a premise. People go, Red Dawn, oh, it's a movie about the Russians invading the United States and a bunch of teenagers fight them off. And I was like, oh, that sounds like a campy, silly movie. And people were like, John Milius, he's this over-the-top sort of man's man kind of guy. So it's like, I was expecting the most jingoistic, goofy, like Rambo's fifth sequel kind of movie. Where I was like, I can't wait for the fakest-looking war movie I've ever seen. And then that is not what Red Dawn is. And I was really fascinated and pleasantly surprised. But in terms of like the plot, the setup of this movie, I already explained it. That's it. We're talking about our main characters are regular. They go to like lengths to make them super regular American kids in the early 80s. It's supposed to be set at the same time that the movie comes out. And then World War III breaks out. And so you're on the journey in a very... just with them the whole time. We never get to see the American military brass. We never see... there's never an address from the president in this movie. It's not like that kind of movie. It's about just the experience of what it would be like. And so once the hypothetical... if you can buy the hypothetical that World War III was possible and might happen, everything after that is played as straight and real as possible. Didn't you think so?
I thought it was played very straight. Let me just start off by saying I only recognize the Chris Hemsworth version of this movie as the real Red Dawn. Just kidding. Wolverines! You know what? So I agree with a lot of that. And the reason it doesn't look fake, we're already getting this early, but there's no CGI or models in this movie. Like, they actually blew up. Everything they blew up was real, which is crazy.
Yeah. It's an action movie, kind of wall to wall, and like that's why I specifically said a Rambo sequel, because it does remind me just a little bit of the original Rambo, which
First
is not
Blood.
as
Yeah,
which is not as silly as people, you might remember thinking about it later. But it's there. One of the things, well, we could start going through the story. There's no backstory given, like hardly of any kind at all. And that's okay with me. I don't mind a movie that takes that approach. It's some movies you really want to, and sometimes you really need to tell us, who are these characters? What are the relationship to each other? And let's get into some specifics so that we could start to relate to them and get to understand them as three-dimensional people. This movie was like, no, that'll come.
yeah.
We're just gonna get started.
Real quick, I want to start right before that part. So we're in class. It's a high school class. They're learning about Genghis Khan. I got two things about that. One, they spelled Genghis Khan wrong on the board. Two, the Genghis Khan picture is actually a character of John Milius. So I thought it was funny. And so Matt Clay and I are watching this together, and the teacher, Mr. Teasdale, is the history teacher. I'm looking at this guy. I'm like, damn, dude, this guy needs to be playing like defensive end for the Raiders or something. Fun fact, he actually played 6 years in the NFL as a defensive tackle for the Bears, Mr. Frank McRae. So I was like, oh, okay, yeah, he looks exactly like
So undoubtedly, he was like friends with John Milius, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's like for sure. And so, being not a professional actor, you could see him like sort of trying to remember his lines, and they're being delivered in sort of a flat way. But it actually is great, I think, because he's a teacher giving like a boring history lesson, and so it comes out as he's the most natural sounding teacher I've seen in a movie ever. I was like, yeah, because so he's delivering, this, and it's a perfectly good lesson. You understand why Milius would have chosen it about Genghis Khan and stuff. And as there's one of the best shots that it was like iconic. As soon as he's talking, in the background out the classroom window on like the football field, you just see paratroopers start landing. And people, this movie is like 3 or 4 minutes in. Like nothing's happened. And then I was saying to Nick, I was like, oh my God, this movie just gets started. We barely know who's even.
I was thinking the whole time, I was like, those Russian paratroopers, as soon as Mr. Teasdale sees them, they are dead, and this movie's going to be 5 minutes. That's what I thought.
What's happening here? They shoot him, teach her in the chest, and then they unload on the kids crowded at the window looking out. And one of the kids dies, and I was like, oh my gosh, there's a dead teenager in the background. But I didn't have to wait for the background, because then Milius just gives us a full-on shot of him hanging for the broken window, bleeding, and I was like, oh, okay, tone set. Got it. This is the tone of this movie. They're going to show.
It's like getting shot out of a cannon. I'll give you a quick anecdote here. I grew up in Orlando. There was a water park called Wet and Wild, right? And you have 2 high slides. One's called the Darastuka, right? You just go and you kind of go down the slide. You can see the whole time. The other one's called the Bombay. So the Bombay is a rocket ship, and you go inside it, and it's dark as hell. And when they decide to press the button, you just drop out of the bottom and you're going shooting down this water slide.
Like a bomb out the bay.
This is the Bombay style. We are just launched into this thing. And this is an action fan's action movie, I think. And it's actually, we were talking about Demolition Man last week. The plot, as silly as the plot sounds, it works. Like, it totally works. And I don't think it was a, propaganda movie or anything to like scare people, because it'd be easy to play on people's fear. We see it done a lot, especially in media outlets and things like that. But in cinema, I looked at more of it like in a what if this happened and things escalated, as opposed to trying to present this movie as a fear movie. I actually thought it was more of a piece on anti-war. I mean, there's obviously an incredible amount of violence to it, but it doesn't glorify with as much killing and blowing up.
I kind of expected it to be that way. Maybe I just had the wrong expectations. I thought it was going to be a movie where it was really black hat, white hat, and it doesn't even turn out to be even that. Mm-hmm. Also, I think that the notion, coming from our perspective, where the time we're in, the concept of maybe having a World War III or a Russian invasion of this kind of thing seems a little too much. Yeah. However, it would have seemed a lot less extra when the movie was made. I mean, it wasn't a totally crazy idea. And with the way that I looked at this movie is, it was very obviously, he said, like, I want to make a movie about World War II and like the French resistance. But what if it was Americans? Like, how would Americans have acted? What would it be like if we watched a movie from an American perspective, but we didn't have to try to relate to Europeans because we just made the movie about Americans? And then just if you wanted to make a movie like that, naturally you would say, who was your enemy going to be? And it was like, well, Soviet Union.
And communists.
Yeah, sure. They have Nicaragua and Cuba. And it's like, yes, those are Soviet allies. Those are communist nations on our continent. And it's like, so as long as, even if you think that's a crazy idea, I would say buy the idea. The same, you watch an alien movie, you buy that aliens are real, and then you get into the movie. Buy the concept, and if you do, then it's like a real drama about individual human beings attempting to live in a ridiculous situation. And it works. That first scene after the Russians land, like I said, it's real as real gets. You've got the teacher and like students and people getting. You've got people. trying to drive in the pickup truck, and kids are jumping in the back of the Swayze's pickup truck. And then the one kid, they pass by, they're like trying to hightail it out of town while Russian soldiers are shooting them. And they pass by, and the one kid sees his own father, and who's yelling at him, and he wants Swayze to stop the car, and he's like, I can't stop the car. And he's like screaming, and he's going, Dad, son, Dad. You see the dad getting pulled to the side in a very realistically shot. It's just a shot itself. There's a lot of wide angles in this movie. This is one of them. It's like a wide of the whole street. There's real fires set on the street. The camera's sort of shaking, and it's like there's things happening in the foreground and things happening in the background, while this man playing the dad is being tugged away by several soldiers, of which there are a ton of extras. And I was like, man, it looks like a documentary.
Yeah.
It's really real. And I was like, just the movie's barely begun, and I went, oh no, I'm in for it. I'm really in.
It looks real on a couple different levels. One, you can kind of imagine that. So I'll go back to that, but I don't think, I know they just redid this with Chris Hemsworth and it did not do very well. To me, and I agree that if you can buy the idea this can happen, then the movie works because you'll buy everything else, and it's about these guys banding together, the last of the, or the resistance and 40 miles behind enemy territory. So if you can buy that, you're good. I don't think we buy that as much now, but when we watch a movie from the early 80s, we can buy it a little bit more. I did see, and so I think there's a way you could do a similar concept. I was actually laughing because at one point when they're bringing all these tanks in, which are actual tanks, and some of them are prop tanks that look like actual tanks, and the CIA is like, wait, there's Russian tanks driving around in New Mexico, what the hell? And so they investigated a thing. And so I was thinking, like, all right, if you were gonna do this and invade, you would pose as almost like reverse Argo us, and you would pose as like a Russian film company going to shoot a war movie in New Mexico, but it's actual tanks and actual guns.
And once they're there, they're like, surprise,
yeah, especially in the 80s. Imagine CIA comes up and they're like, oh, what's going on here? It seems a little fishy. Russians, you got all your tanks. And Russians like, oh, we're shooting a movie. Like, oh, cool. Yeah, they just shoot a movie. One time I was getting coffee, and he'd tell you his movie star story. So Charles Manson one time.
I used to act in high school.
Yeah, exactly. If you need anybody, that's what you get. And then I was also thinking, because the premise alone is good. You could put it in any country. Obviously, this has happened, and so, but on U.S. soil, it's only really happened twice, right? So we have the British in Louisiana at one point.
Well, the War of 1812.
War of 1812. And then we also have a situation, and so I'm going to pitch you this movie, Red Dawn 2, which I would have loved to seen, but during World War II, which would technically be like a reverse sequel because it happened before, but in World War II, the Japanese occupied some islands in Alaska. And so I'm going like, you know what? Like, that I would watch. Like, if you show me that story where you have these Alaskan natives trying to fight off like some minor Japanese military in like rural Alaska and it's freeze, like, I'm in for that. I don't know.
It would be fascinating, to see either native peoples or Americans who have moved there. Because I've been to Alaska. The people who are up there are characters. They're interesting, and it's kind of just like, it kind of reminds me of the one line that Bogart has in Casablanca when they're asking him like about, hey, are you one of these people can't imagine us in Paris? And he's like, not really my Paris. What about London? He goes, well, ask me when you get there. They go, well, what about New York? And he says to the Nazis, well, Major, there are certain parts of New York I wouldn't advise you to try to invade. And that's Alaska. It's like, you could go ahead and try, but I don't see if you could avoid Alaskans, because
that would feel like Return of the Jedi when they go to the forest moon of Endor. You got the Ewoks fighting.
I had to get bopped on the head. It's true. Yeah, I know a dude who I talked to him. I met a guy who lived up there, but he also worked on an island with natives, and like it's kind of the Wild West up there, because like he's told some crazy story about how he didn't have his papers to be outside of the town, and he went walking anyway with this other buddy, and they came. Some tribesmen came riding up on a horse, because it's like, hey, you're clearly not a member of You're not supposed to, what are you doing here? And the dude opens up his bag to show him a sawed-off shotgun and goes, these are our papers. Is that good enough for you? And I was like, that's not a real-life story. This didn't really happen. Are you insane? It's like, yeah, so imagine that.
Yeah. But I would watch the hell out of that.
But similarly, not exactly the same, but Red Dawn goes for that because at least a couple of the characters are just guys who they're like dudes who are in high school, right? So, or just finished high school. So they're of military age. They know how to use weapons and things because they're hunters, and they establish this. And it's like, obviously there's millions of Americans like that. And so it's like, it's not nuts to think that you'd have athletic 19-year-old dudes who play football and know how to use guns would be able to put up something of an interesting fight. It's like, yeah, and there's plenty of Americans that fit right into that. It's the hypothetical continues to work. I wasn't rolling my eyes going, oh, come on. I can't imagine these people doing that. It's like, because we say kids and go, yeah, like what, a high school senior? That's who normally fights wars.
Yeah, and they're fighting like they're high school kids. I mean, they're not like flanking or doing smart thing. They're like taking their weapons and just using them how they know how to use them. Like, they're not planting traps necessarily. There is a couple that are like pretty big. I feel like the stuff that they do is things you believe that they could have learned from watching a war movie.
And it's things we know they could do because we have, if you make the comparison to the European resistances of the places like France, for example, like this stuff is just pulled out of their playbook where you setting traps. Like the one character, I think it's Leah Thompson's character. She there's the two girls, but I think one of them does it. Doesn't matter. Jennifer Grey maybe has the bomb that's in like a basket.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And so she rides up on a couple of jerks and Russian guys in a tank. I call them jerks because they're all misogynists in this movie, like vicious rapists for some reason. But anyway, and so they start like grabbing her in their disgusting, awful way, and they take her stuff, her like bag, and then it blows up after they take it. And she does another one later where she plants a bomb in a storefront, and they have her do it because. Just war being war, the woman passes by and the soldiers are all distracted by the fact that she's female and don't think of her as enough of a threat. So that's how it would happen. We know that that's how it would happen because it's how it did happen in France. Yes, planting bombs and things like that. And I was sort of thrown off by how successful a lot of their plots were. But, when you think about it, they were always ambush. Mm-hmm. There was every single one of their things that they do is always just laying in wait.
Right.
And it's really hard to fight back when you've walked into a trap. And then halfway through the movie, casualties do eventually start to happen. So it's, like I said, it's a realism.
It's
not that hard to imagine.
It's very real. I mean, it's a lot darker than your normal action movie for sure. I actually had a note about it where I'm like, this gun makes you think that war is not very good. Where if you watch Top Gun, you're like in line to sign up for the military the next day. But you watch this, you're like, I don't know.
That's a good one because I thought it was going to be Top Gun.
I thought it would be way more Top Gunny, but like the dialogue, actually. So we'll get into Milius at some point, but the dialogue I thought for the kids was done pretty good. I thought the villain's dialogue was not the best. I thought it was like.
I bought it. I think it was. I agree with you about the kids, but I also kind of think it's true for everybody. One of the things that's nice is Milius is definitely a writer first. One of the he's done 100 things, but he's definitely a writer first. So the dialogue is much more like how people would talk in real life. It's not movie dialogue. Right. People aren't like using each other's names unnecessarily. When something happens and it's obvious to every character on screen what happened, they just react. They don't stop and have somebody say it out loud so that the audience understands and that we can just have it said. If it was possible to just tell the whole story by showing an event, they just show the event.
Right.
And then they just move on. It's not overwritten. And in line with the fact that it's not Top Gun, they made real characters out of the Russians and the Nicaraguans and the Cubans, the villains of the movie. They made real characters out of them. I was really drawn by, there's a scene where the kids see a truck coming up the mountainside, heading basically in their direction, and they run away and go, we got to tell them they're coming this way. Then we don't see the kids. We just start hanging out with the 3 Russian soldiers. And there's a very long moment where they're reading the sign. The one guy's pretending he knows how to read English. So he's reading this very long park sign about about a historical event, but he's making it up as it goes. And it's revealed that the kids are actually hiding behind a rock. But the thing is, what I'm talking about is how we spend a couple of minutes with those Russians for the fight scene in which they eventually die. And so they're humanized. They're not nameless, faceless necessarily in the same way that it's like you could have just had them be, like I said, Black Hat, but it was like, no, they have jokes. They're sitting there taking pictures. Hey, get a picture with the sign.
Well, I thought the behavior and the, I guess the attitude of the characters was awesome. And since we're talking about characters, I'm sure we have some listeners that don't know a lot about John Milius. So Clay alluded to the fact that he's a writer. I'm going to throw some things at you that he wrote. Or he did a lot of script consulting and punching up. He wrote the line, "Go ahead and make my day" for Clint Eastwood, the Dirty Harry series. You can see the poster behind Clay's head, the Jaws poster. He wrote for his good friend Steven Spielberg the USS Indianapolis scene in Jaws, which is one of the best scenes in cinema history, in my opinion, and probably a lot of other people's. Saving Private Ryan, he punched up. Indiana Jones, the Star Wars movies. He was always and so Milius went to USC, met Spielberg, fell in the group with Spielberg, Lucas, those guys, Coppola, and they're all buddies. And so Milius, he'd be one of those guys that he wasn't an amazing director. I think he was a really good story guy for writing. I don't, from beginning to end, I don't know that every script he wrote was the best thing ever, but he's a great idea guy, has a great idea of how movies should go. And you can tell.
And natural dialogue.
Those guys used him for everything they did. And it says a lot because those are some of the greatest directors of all time. This guy just knew his shit. He's kind of like the jack of all trades from that standpoint, but he had his hand in so many different things.
Yeah. And there's a whole documentary about John Milius because he's a character of a guy. He's this he's like an sort of roided out version of Hemingway.
I got you. So if you need a physical reference, he's good friends with the Coen brothers, and the character Walter from The Big Lebowski is based off John Milius.
Yes.
If you didn't know that, and they actually wanted him to play in the movie Barton Fink, the role John Goodman played. This guy is Walter. He's outrageous. He's on the board of the NRA. He carried a loaded gun with him on the set the entire shoot. It is a nut. Clearly, he wrote Apocalypse Now too. And I think I left that one off. But this guy wanted to be in the military, and he famously said, the military wouldn't allow him to be in because he had asthma. But so I did the next closest thing to be a general. I became a director, which is kind of funny.
Well, I can see watching Red Dawn. You can see these moments of real facts, sort of little moments of truth, things that the characters do and say, where I'm like, okay, this is directly out of the mouth of John Milius, where he's talking about, for example, the weapons, how they work, and when the characters are referencing them and when they're using them, you can tell it's okay, this isn't a screenwriter who never picked up a gun before, who's trying to figure out how to write for guns. Right. It was no, this is a guy who knows how weapons work, and he writes it the right way. Stories about for example, there's a moment when they're up in the mountains because they go there instantly after the invasion to hide in this group of teenagers, and the first thing they manage to do, it seems, after they argue for a little bit, is kill a deer for food. And they make the one kid, they find out it's his first kill. They make the kid drink the blood.
Yeah.
It's like, this sounds so insanely over the top, but they play it straight. And they have, the other two characters. And I'm like, are they punking him? Because I'm not a hunter. I'm like, are they punking him? And then he really drinks it. And they don't laugh. They go, yeah, my dad says once you do that, you're never the same afterwards. And I believe that's the kid who ends up being like hardcore nuts. But they were like, yeah, good for you. And they hold on him for a real long time with blood all over his face. And he's just like, it wasn't that bad. It wasn't that bad. And I'm like, I think this is not, Milius isn't making anything up. I think this must have happened.
Yeah, no, somewhere that happened. I mean, this guy, Milius was a big historian too. So a lot of those things probably came from history. I know he did a lot of stuff with Teddy Roosevelt, with the Rough Riders.
Roosevelt makes an appearance on that sign the Russians pretending to read.
Yeah. Oh God, he did it. Oh God, he's we're starting to do Alexander the Great. He wanted to actually do we're supposed to do an Alexander the Great movie with Jean-Claude Van Damme as the lead. Yeah, I know. I don't know why no one signed off on it. I want to see this. We will never get that movie.
I want to point out that this movie's 1984. The cast is like bananas.
Yeah.
Patrick Swayze, you would probably say, is like maybe the top lead. You also have C. Thomas Howell, Leah Thompson, in a really fascinating, great role for her because she's playing a very young person who has suffered some kind of a moment or some sort of trauma, but they don't bother getting into it. And again, it's kind of just like, it doesn't matter because this is a war movie. If you think of these teenagers as soldiers, then you realize when you watch a war movie, it's very normal to have somebody have a hot temper. And it's like, why? And it's like, you don't have to ask why in a war movie. Soldiers are like, because the dude's been through some serious shit.
Yeah. Real quick, if you guys at home don't know who Leah Thompson is, she played the mom in Back to the Future also.
Exactly. If you don't recognize the name. You recognize the face for sure.
Yeah.
Jennifer Grey is in it. Dirty Dancing, Jennifer Grey, right? But Harry Dean Stanton. All right, I want to ask you about this scene. So Harry Dean Stanton, who I recognize most from, he's one of the two mechanics on the ship in Alien, the original Alien. He plays the father of the characters played by Swayze and Charlie Sheen. And early on in this timeline, the boys find out that people have been arrested and put into a re-education camp. And they find the camp and they're standing at a fence, like a double fence. And they get a guy in there to go find their dad. And it turns out to be the character played by Harry Dean Stanton. And it is this super touching, scary, real scene of what it might be like, what it would have been like in real life for a dad to be facing possibly the end of his life, looking at his two sons. When he says things that might in another, if it wasn't handled properly, come out dorky and like out of a movie, where he says, I'm not going to be there to pick you up when you fall down anymore. You two are going to have to look after each other. It didn't sound like out of a movie. It was real. The performances were really, really good. And I was like texting you like, dude, I did not expect this movie to get me like emotionally, but it does.
Yeah, and it works as we don't need a lot of backstory. We kind of, again, we talked about before with characters. We do. I like the dialogue of the heroes. We disagree a little bit on how the villains spoke necessarily, but with these characters, we learn who they are through their actions, right? Which is way stronger than having a guy with funny jokes all the time. It's, well, what does this character do? How does this character react to conflict? And we learn that right off the bat. We know who everyone is. I actually heard when they were shooting this, one of the things Milius did was have Swayze, anytime there was an acting note, he had him to the kids, the younger actors, he had Swayze deliver it. so he can maintain the leadership type role in their minds. And per Swayze in an interview later, he's like, yeah, I don't think people like that much, that I was, didn't really know them and I was giving them these things, but it works. I mean, you never know what these little extra things you can do like that in a movie to make the acting a little bit better, make these moments really, I mean, there's very carved out moments, and that's why we know who these characters are off the bat.
And much like a good horror movie, when in a bad horror movie, you have characters making decisions that don't make any sense, but you're like, no, don't run into the attic, And then in a good horror movie, they make smart choices, where they say they have a proper reaction. And in this movie, I find that it's largely true that the people have a proper reaction. So you mentioned Swayze's the leader. Well, when he first kind of asserts that, because he happens to be like a year or two older, or whatever it is, and he drives them out to the woods, and they go like, we kind of don't want to wait in the woods. All we have here is like snack food. This isn't going to work. And he goes, no, you're not going back. They're like, how about we put it to a vote? And he's like, no. So they actually resent him, and they go, and there's this cool scene, again, in one of those wide shots, so there's no trickery with the editing, where they're having a physical argument over a real campfire. Like, the actors are, like, tripping through the real campfire. And so they push back. They don't like the idea that because he used to be a high school quarterback, that they're now supposed to listen to him like he's the boss. And it's like, yeah, that comes off real to me. Some of the characters are more interested in fighting, and some of them are like, I don't want to kill. They don't just shoot the Russians and then every single one of them is on board, especially in the early part of the story, where they go, yep, kill them all. No, the characters go, they don't want to shoot anybody. And they start talking. They're like, that's a real person. And again, like, humanizing the enemy in a really realistic way. It's like, yes, people would say that. People would say that. If we were invaded today, some people might be the first ones who pull triggers. And there will be a lot of other people going like, I don't want to kill anybody. I don't care if they have invaded.
Umpums. Saving Private Ryan reference.
Yeah, it's real.
You brought up, I'll give you the least realistic moment in this entire movie. So they mentioned that Patrick Swayze is a former high school quarterback.
Yeah. And
then they later cut to his high school football photo. Do you know what number he was wearing in that photo?
What was it, like double digits or something?
Number 89. And if you can show me one quarterback ever to wear number 89, like, I don't know whose job it was that day to get that picture, but Milius is clearly not a football guy. I know our boy, Mr. Teasdale, Frank McRae, from the beginning is like shaking his head.
Nick, I don't mean to stereotype, but the people who are choosing the costumes for movies are like you're cut from a catalog football.
Yeah. No, it's like, yeah, exactly. Well, it's like, hey, here's the jersey I found in the Sears catalog. Let's put it on him and take our football photo.
Just got a jersey, yeah.
Come on. You were born at night. It wasn't last night, guys. God, I completely forgot. Well, I was going to say, too, so you're talking about they're fighting over the fire. This was, I couldn't tell how cold everyone was, but evidently, like, they were shooting at sometimes in minus 17 degree temperatures. Like, this was at the time, I don't know, past 86, but it was the coldest movie condition-wise ever shot on record. Like, that, I would be miserable, but at no point did they look cold. I mean, it's a hard for the actors out there. If it's not, if it's 100 degrees, you got to act like it's winter. That's really hard, and vice versa. So the fact they're not just shivering out of their boots, I know they had some protective gear on, but
they looked normal cold. They didn't look miserable cold. They looked appropriate for the story because they're in the mountains. It's snowy. Because the timeline of the story, it's really, it blows through time really fast. The scenes are never longer than they have to be. And as long as the cuts of the individual shots there's a lot of long cuts and wide angles. The scenes are really tight, most of them, and short.
Yeah.
And so there was a really good, I was starting to wonder how long they'd been out there at one point, maybe say it was 20 minutes in the movie or something. And they find somebody in a cabin and they start eating and they mention something about 5 weeks. And I was like, good, because I needed to know that, but it was also a very natural way to tell me that info. And then later somebody said something about, well, I think there's rumors that they're gonna send you some special forces in the spring. And then he's like, spring's a long way away. And then it says like January on the card. So you see all the snowy stuff, and then eventually when the snow is gone, then you're like, okay, that means a lot of time has passed. It's over a whole winter kind of a thing. And that again, it was reasonably well told. If this was supposed to happen in like a day or a week or a month, that would be harder. It's almost like he just made a World War II movie and just switched it.
Right. Well, it's really interesting to make a timeline of like the spring. They'll hopefully be there, because that gives you something. They're not just going to get bailed out of the thing. I mean, I kind of actually, be honest with you, I expected the whole time. And then you see those helicopters that then they have like red stars on them. Like, I don't know, are they getting bailed out? This one, like, oh no, they're not. They just shot it with a rocket launcher.
I kept thinking the whole movie. I was like, especially because of how. So roughly halfway through the film, this gang of characters, they have been reasonably successful in their sabotage efforts, and I was like, okay, I don't know yet, but at the moment, the most unbelievable thing is that none of these people are dying, because yes, it is possible. Everyone knows from the American wars in places such as Iraq, and the Soviets would know because they had a war in Afghanistan, and then of course Vietnam, and then. And like you said, even if you go back to the American Revolutionary War, guerrilla tactics can be somewhat successful. But the other thing that's true is that the body count of insurgents and guerrillas, no matter what the war is pretty high. And I was like, some of these people would be dead by now. And it was roughly when I started to think that way that they started killing off characters.
Yeah. Just raise the stakes. And I got a couple other funny things. I want to talk about my two favorite scenes in the movie. So at the time, this was the Guinness Book of Records. This had the most acts of violence of any film up to this time. And per Guinness, 134 acts of violence per hour, or 2.23 acts of violence per minute in this movie. Thus, we have, drumroll, the first ever major motion picture that was PG-13.
That's right.
Yeah. And now, there's no way it's PG-13 movie now. There's too much blood.
Yeah, because this is 84. Yes, right.
Because kids getting killed. There's just absolutely no way this...
It would have been ours, what you're saying?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, for sure.
Oh, God.
A couple of scenes stand out. You know what? Because a lot of action movies, especially now, they're so fast. It's just the way we consume information now. It's like quick, more, cut. There's some scenes that breathe. One of them is it looks like the Russians have set a trap. There's a box of food that falls off a truck, and we're talking about this, going like, oh my God, it's a trap. The score behind it is fantastic, because you're going
because there's very minimal score in this movie in general, which helps makes it feel real. And then that scene, yes, there's some food potentially, and the music is telling you, don't do it, guys, you're gonna die. And
that but also shows you. I was also going like, I don't think she didn't think it's a trap. I just think they had to be so hungry that you're willing to roll the dice and see what happens.
Yeah, so you've got Jennifer Grey, I think, is her character. Tony runs out there, and they're looking at her through their scopes, and she grabs it and she starts eating, and she looks back in their direction, and she puts it just on a very long lens, and she puts two hands in the air, and I was like, that's it. This is when she gets shot through the chest. I was waiting for it. I was just waiting for the boom.
Yeah.
But she doesn't, and I was like, I like that, because you had me, man.
You're just holding your breath, and you're just waiting for it. That's what you want to feel in a movie to me, a movie like this should make you feel that way. You go to a horror movie, you want to be scared a little bit. This should make you fear a little bit there's different ways to get this effect. One, we have just the build up. I know you saw 1917 recently. For those listening that haven't seen 1917, there's different ways to get this effect. So one is use of score, use of cinematography. Like there's a ton of things that build up to it. 1917, what made that great is it's shot as if it's a one take, and whether people know it or not, if something doesn't cut you feel anxious. It makes you anxious. It's scientifically proven to make you feel anxious, and so you get the feeling like you're there. And that's, to me, the biggest scene in the movie where I go like, oh my God, she's going to get blown up, and it makes you kind of like cringe up just waiting for it. And it didn't happen. So I thought it was a strong choice.
And because you have characters in very real danger and peril, and you characters actually being injured and dying real early in the movie, and pretty consistently throughout, then we, as the audience, are legit afraid for the death of these characters, where we know that or at least you probably feel like at any time they can die. And whether we know it or not, most of the time when we watch a movie, we're not really afraid for most of the main characters. Because generally speaking, you can't be a main character if you get shot 20 minutes in. You know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. And so we know that when we watch a movie. Even when you're watching Saving Private Ryan, you know, you're thinking to yourself, Tom Hanks isn't going to get shot. You know what I mean?
Right.
And so this movie was like, man, I really don't know who would be safe. I don't, and that's that's the situation the characters are in. So I'm certain Milius would have said, I want the audience to be afraid that these people might die at any time.
Yeah, and once they start going, you're like, I think it's because you're used to the group, and you're going like, you get to a point where like, oh my God, well, at least like one or two of them need to make it out of here. Like you need them to make it out. And we obviously know what happens. We'll leave the ending up in the air. But speaking of characters dying, one of the main characters in the group gets a homing beacon. They make him swallow a homing beacon. So we have the scene where
the audience doesn't know it until the other characters know it, which is interesting. There's no scene of him being captured and all that.
It does. I'm sure they shot that. Noah Milius. I'm sure he shot that, and I'm sure it was like verbatim how they would have done it in like Vietnam, or knowing Milius. The consultant on staff. But it's a thing where now they're faced with this guy who's been their friend, who went against what the group stood for, and then he's gonna really screw the whole group over because he got a tracker in him, and so they're gonna kill him, and they have to decide like, are we gonna kill this guy or basically they're all going to die if they, or if they leave him out there, the guy's going to die. If they just shoot him, he's going to die. And so that was a very powerful scene.
Yeah, because they're wondering about they figure out that he's been bugged, and he tells them like, dude, they caught me. They did terrible things to me, and it was like, it feels real. And then they also happen to have a captured Russian soldier who, again, they give a lot of lines. They give him realistic sounding. He's attempting to curse them out in English, and he only knows a handful of words. And it's like, is it funny when he does that with like this bad English cursing? I didn't laugh. It just feels like, yeah, that's something a real person would say. Because you were talking about the dialogue of the bad guys. None of the Russians or Nicaraguans or Cubans ever speak English. And of course is what we say, but you got to think about it. We say that now, generally speaking. To give subtitles in a movie, it was like you could have a couple of subtitled lines, but it would have been very easy and normal with a weaker director to have them just speak with like Russian accents and speak in English.
Well, I should say specifically, I didn't like the way the two main leaders spoke together. Every time we heard them talk, it was a two-shot, and it was very plot. To me, all they were doing is divulging plot. And I think other than that, he's good at moving things around. Because I saw the Russian soldier they captured. That guy I liked, and I liked when they were by the sign. And it made me think, I know he did some work on Saving Private Ryan. And did that character not remind you of the same guy's the German that they capture in Saving Private Ryan, and the way he's trying to talk about America, Elvis Presley.
Yeah,
He's like doing all this
stuff.
It.
Yeah, exactly.
He's not trying to be funny, but like but that guy actually is, that scene was not funny, I guess. But
so they get that Russian soldier and they get their guy that ratted him out, and they want to kill him, but they're very realistically arguing it. They go like, we can't shoot him, he's one of us. And the dude says something about the Geneva Convention, and Swayze's character says, never heard of it, And so again, like, who's the bad guy? And you even have the lines that Charlie Sheen's character yells. He's yelling at him, at his big brother, not to execute these guys. He says, what's the difference between us? How are we different from them if we do this? Why? What's the point if we're just going to do the same thing they do? Again, things real people would say. And Swayze's character says, because we live here. And it doesn't matter if that's a good or a bad rationale, but because it seems like that's exactly what the rationale would be. So I was like, damn, I feel like this is like a real event. It somehow made it feel like it was really happening because this is how people would talk in the situation.
Right.
He ends up not having the guts to shoot. He shoots the Russian, but he can't shoot the other kid. But the kid that they have well established is really snapped ever since he found out his parents were dead. He does the shooting. And I'm like, I buy it because they've been indicating that kid he's got the 1,000-yard stare now.
Yeah, exactly.
He's full,
He's starting to lose it.
And I was like, I buy all of this. I buy every beat of it. Yeah, I was really, I guess I have a lot to say about it.
We've never seen it, so that was just, I thought it was going to be 80s action. I didn't really know what to expect.
Shoot 'em up.
Yeah,
good times. Yeah. Bond fighting, the
by the way,
Russians.
1984. I don't have a whole lot more specific movie stuff, but I do have some general fun stuff. Did you know John Milius was one of the original creators of the UFC? Not only that, like it was his idea to have the octagon as opposed to a normal box ring. And is that the least surprising fact you've ever heard in your life? John Milius.
He's like, what if we just had real men bare knuckle brawling each other?
It
never comes in.
Lead investor.
And this is a movie made by a guy like that.
Yeah.
And it's like I said, the details are all in there. It's when in a lot of movies, if somebody dies, they give them like a makeshift cross when they bury them. In this case, there was one soldier, as an airman, who had fallen, and when he died, they did the upside down rifle and the helmet on top of it, which is like the battlefield cross thing. And it's like, I'm not in the military, but I'm watched. I'm like, I'm pretty sure that's a real thing. That's how it's really, but it's subtle. It's just sort of in there. And I would go, that's the Milius touch, where he cares to try to make it more realistic. I was almost like, yeah, sure. But the guy who was actually in the military is the one dead. All these other ones are like high school football players. Like, I don't know if they know what to do.
Allegedly.
And even though, you didn't love the way that the bad guy spoke, they made the colonel, who I can't tell, I don't remember if he was Cuban. I think they were trying to say he was Cuban. They made him real enough where he's not only talking about plot. He has a couple of things where he talks about how he was a guerrilla fighter in this war and this war and this war, and previously, and now he's not. He's like, now I'm a policeman, is his sort of wry complaint, where he was like, he doesn't know what it means to be on the winning side, but he's been a soldier his whole life. And so he says that a few times, and then he says he does like a love letter. He's writing a love letter, and you hear the voiceover of what he's writing back home to some person that he's in love with, and then he's attacked. And so there's enough buildup so that when he finally sees Swayze carrying the body of Charlie Sheen, and he has the opportunity to shoot him dead, he lets him go. That made sense. I mean, I don't think Swayze doesn't make it out of the movie, but it's necessarily at that moment. But the point is, he doesn't pull the trigger at that moment. And I believe it because it was properly set up. Even though he was just a villain who probably had 11 minutes of screen time, he was still three-dimensional with a story that I bought.
You know who he reminded me a lot of was Javert from Les Miserables.
Oh, yeah, that was
Javert. Watching it. Especially at the end.
Yeah. Yeah, kind of, where he's like,
I
am from the gutter, too. Dude, this is great. I could probably go on for a long time. I really like when we do a movie where I could say pretty much just good stuff the whole time.
It's been a while. It's been a while. That was a lot of fun. It's not too long. Like there's great. It's shot well. It's written well. The characters are there. Yeah, I thought. I mean, definitely holds up. It's worth a watch. I mean, I definitely saw the new one that came out. I wasn't into it. I don't know that I even finished it, but this one, it holds up. And I do think this is true to at the time what it would have been like if a bunch of kids got stuck behind enemy lines if we were invaded. Absolutely. That's what I would do. I wouldn't know exactly what I was doing.
Super well acted, really well shot. It looks almost like a documentary. The effects are all real and enormous. Massive explosions that are clearly not miniatures. It's worth watching, dude. This movie's got the goods.
And the sways.
And besides, Patrick Swayze.
Powers Booth. We didn't bring up Powers Booth.
There's too many great actors in this movie. There's just like a long list of them. Yeah. Well, I loved it, and I'm glad we watched it. We're going to come back again next Tuesday, and this will be available on Wednesday morning, podcast style. And we're really excited to keep the ball rolling. So I hope everybody's staying happy and healthy out there. But, this is Matthew, Nick. We're going to catch you next time on Film Flashback.